Uh-oh. Sounds like somebody's got a case of the Mondays.
All right, folks. I'm going to do the thing that you're not supposed to do. I'm going to look ahead. Because I got to be honest, there's not much reason to focus on Northwestern. Not on this Monday. Maybe later in the week, we'll preview them a little bit. But Ohio State opened up as a 25.5-point favorite. They're already, as I record this, up to a 28-point favorite. It could climb the rest of the week. We could see this spread get into the 30s. So I'm going to tell you why it's okay to peek ahead a little bit to that huge Wisconsin clash. We're going to talk some college football, the rankings, and why they're bogus. Coming up next on Unscripted Ohio.
You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove and in part by JFQ Lending. All your home purchase and refinance needs should be handled by a Buckeye. You'll never pay for your appraisal with these guys. Licensed in 33 states and more on the way. Check them out at jfqlending.com. For the latest news, notes, analysis, and discussion, check us out on BuckeyeGrove.com and follow us on Twitter at UnscriptedOhio1. Now, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! Can we get some meatloaf?
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Monday. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio podcast. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. We are brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com, as well as our title sponsor, JFQ Lending. All of your mortgage and refinance needs should be handled by a Buckeye, licensed in 33 states and more on the way. Please check them out at jfqlending.com. Tell them Kyle over at Unscripted Ohio sent you. We are also here with thanks to support by GoBus. Ohio's rural intercity bus system can bring you back to Columbus for Ohio State sporting events with over 40 stops to locations across the state. Visit them at ridegobus.com or give them a call, 1-888-95-GO-BUS. Ohio State has 6 games remaining on the schedule, okay? And you look at the schedule, there's most definitely a couple of these games that Ohio State is capable of losing. When you look at the 6 remaining scheduled games, I would say 4 of them are legitimate contests, ones that you have to, I don't want to say lie awake at night worrying about Ohio State losing, but there are 4 definite games that you got to pay attention to, and you got to go in thinking, Ohio State's going to have to show up. They're going to have to show up, obviously, next weekend against Wisconsin. As I record this, we don't officially know what time that game is going to be in Columbus, but I can tell you this. It's almost assuredly going to be a noon kickoff on Fox. We're hearing rumblings that that's going to be the case. It'll probably be confirmed later today. We believe that's going to be a noon kickoff, and I can tell you ESPN's College Game Day is most likely going to be there when you look at the rest of the college football schedule. So Wisconsin, probably a noon kickoff on Fox next Saturday in Columbus. That game is huge. I'm going to talk about the Badgers a little bit because they're really catching my eyes. If you're not convinced yet, you should be. That defense is legit. Interestingly enough, look, Ohio State's run game statistically has actually been better than Wisconsin's this year, which is crazy for all of the press clippings and all of the attention that Jonathan Taylor in that run game has gotten. Ohio State is actually a better run game, but statistically, analytically, practically speaking, Wisconsin's defense might actually be the best in the country. Ohio State's, if they're not number 1, is probably number 2, but Wisconsin is giving them a run for their money. So you look at the schedule. Northwestern this weekend, yawn. Ohio State wins this one. I'll explain that in a minute. You've got Wisconsin. You've got Rutgers. That's probably a win. It should be a win, or we've got a lot to talk about. Maryland, look, I know everybody has that wild game fresh in their minds from last year over there in College Park. And the way Maryland started this season, you have to at least respect that they have talent on this roster. I don't know where it went. I don't know what happened to it. It hasn't been showing up since the first 2 weeks of the season, but it's there. I'm going to give that game one of those in the category where Ohio State has to actually play well, because Maryland could get them if they're looking ahead. But Penn State definitely and Michigan definitely. So okay, we'll say 3.5 games that Ohio State most definitely has to show up for. But Northwestern is not one of those. Ohio State, look, I don't like to assume that any game, especially a power conference game, a Big Ten game, is an automatic win. But have you seen Northwestern? I'm not going to spend a lot of time previewing them. I'll have an opponent preview on Friday. We'll talk a little bit with Ross probably on Wednesday about what Ohio State is doing scheme-wise. Maybe not specifically to this game, but I want to talk about it because you can't just assume Ohio State's going to show up and win. We've seen upsets before. Ohio State, I know we bring this up so many times. Michigan State in 1998, a 28-point underdog, came into Ohio Stadium and knocked off Ohio State. It happens. As we record this, Ohio State is a 28-point favorite on the road at Northwestern. Now, that Michigan State team, I think, is better than this Northwestern team, but it still happens. That's the point. And so we can't assume it's an automatic win. But Northwestern right now is ranked 127 out of 130 FBS teams in yards per play on offense. They're capable of showing up on Friday night and at least making Ohio State's offense uncomfortable. They've got a good defense. They're still ranked in the top 40, I think, in yards per play. They're capable of slowing down this Ohio State offense, especially if Ohio State comes out. And are they looking ahead to Wisconsin? Probably not, but you still could come out flat on a weird road game on Friday night when everybody's watching, at least everybody that's in front of their televisions. There might be a lot of people that are out, watching high school football or just hanging out with the family and they're not turning on the football game. But the people that are watching on a Friday night, there's nothing else to do. If they're home, they're watching this game. It could be one of those weird results. We've seen it happen before. Clemson struggled on a Friday night against Clemson last year, or against Syracuse last year. These kind of games, you feel a little awkward going in because you just don't know how they're going to play out. Northwestern's defense, still pretty good. It's not as good as last year, but it's good enough to keep them in games. But their offense, what happened to it? They've got a former 5-star quarterback that's not playing very well. They have no run game to speak of. Their line has been terrible. This is a really bad offense. At 3.8 yards per play, which is 127 out of 130 in FBS. To give you an idea of how unspeakably bad that is, the next closest power conference team in terms of yards per play is Rutgers. They're the second worst power conference offense in the country right now. And they're averaging 4.4 yards per play. Over a half a yard better than Northwestern. And this is a Rutgers team that out of their last 50 Big Ten games, 25% of them they passed for under 50 yards. So for Rutgers to be practically lapping Northwestern, it says a lot about the Northwestern offense. At least last year with that defense, and Northwestern was not a great offense by any stretch of the imagination, but they were good enough to beat you if you didn't play well. Remember, for 2.5, 3 quarters last year, Northwestern was giving Ohio State a little bit of a scare in the Big Ten championship. Ohio State eventually pulled away, won by over 3 touchdowns, but it was at least a competitive game. See, here's the thing. On Friday night, Northwestern could show up and hold Ohio State to 21, 24 points. That's possible. I could see that happening. That's a legitimate, realistic scenario. Yeah, they've notoriously got that high grass that seems to slow teams down. I think that's a secret to their success, holding teams below their season averages over there in Evanston. So Ohio State could be held to under 30 points. It might not be a track meet. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think Ohio State still winds up winning by 30 plus, but it could happen. But even if Ohio State is held to 24 points, where's Northwestern getting the scoring from? I can't see them punching the ball in the end zone 3 times. Even if they get a defensive or special teams score, I still don't see them coming up with more than 21. So I'll never say never, but I don't see Northwestern having enough oomph to win this game. They're just really that bad offensively. But look, it's going to take something just short of a miracle for Northwestern to win. So I am looking ahead a little bit to Wisconsin. And it's only human. I don't play the game. I don't have to prepare. I know some of you are overly superstitious. I wouldn't say I'm superstitious. I'm not even a little bit stitious. That's a quote from The Office, by the way. If you're not an Office fan, I think most of you listening probably are. You probably recognize that quote. I'm going to look ahead to Wisconsin, though. I think the Badgers are the real deal. They had another shutout on Saturday. Yes, they've played some so-so offenses in that time. Central Michigan, Kent State. I know that not every team that they've played has been a juggernaut. But Wisconsin has the best scoring defense in the country right now. And it's not just scoring defense. They have the best defense in terms of yards per play. And out of curiosity, I looked this up. I have a little stat. You saw me probably posting on Twitter on Sunday. I'm going to explain the stat first. I have this little metric that I like to use. I think it's a good comparison, relatively speaking. I think it's good to cross-compare how teams are actually performing based on not just how they've done, but how they've done relative to the competition. And I think the best way to do that is yards per play. And the reason being is yards per play is a little more predictable going forward. It aligns with future wins and losses a little bit better than scoring, because within scoring you get some fluky stats and fluky results sometimes. First of all, you have to eliminate offense, or you have to eliminate defensive and special teams scoring. If you have 2 pick sixes to the house in a given game, that's not repeatable. You can't expect that going forward. That's not something you should predict. So you kind of have to account for that. You kind of have to account for maybe a really bad night in the red zone. If you get down to the red zone 5 times and you're only able to punch it in once, that's a kind of a fluky result. That's not something that's usually repeatable, especially if you've had success throughout the season in the red zone. So for many of these reasons, I like to use yards per play because they're a little more steady going forward in terms of predictive results. And so but you can't just look at yards per play in a vacuum, because you have to account for the vast differences in scheduling. And so what I like to do is I like to take yards per play on offense and defense, and I like to adjust it to what the competition has done. So it's one thing to say a team has averaged 7 yards per play on offense, but what is your defense, the defense that you've played? What have they done over the course of a year? And this is where Wisconsin really comes out looking impressive, because Wisconsin's yards per play based on offense compared to what their defense's season averages are, their opponent's defense that is, they have 1.3 yards per play above what their defenses typically allow. Defensively, though, where Wisconsin stands out is they're 2.1 yards per play better than what the offenses that they've played this year have averaged. So what you get is a net with Wisconsin of 3.4 yards per play, offense and defense. That's combined, basically a sum above and beyond their competition. That 2.1 yards per play above their opponent's offensive averages, by the way, is the best in the country. Ohio State is 1.8. Where Ohio State comes out impressively is the balance that the Buckeyes have, because they have an offense that is 1.8 yards per play better than their defensive opponent's season averages. And they also have a defense that is 1.8 yards per play above the offensive opponent's season averages. So you've got Ohio State 3.6 net yards per play, Wisconsin 3.4 net yards per play. Those are the 2 best teams in college football in that metric, by the way. And I got to tell you, there was a lot of hand-wringing about the Big Ten, but early in the season, there was a lot of there were a few high-profile losses, a few disappointing losses, and it looked like the Big Ten was really bad. But as the season has gone along, I got to tell you, I think right now, I really truly believe this league is the best in the country, and it's because of the defenses. And I heard this stated on the Penn State, Iowa broadcast Saturday night. It used to be 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Everybody talked about how great the SEC defenses were. And that's one of the reasons why the SEC was the best league in the country year after year. But the Big Ten has kind of taken over for the SEC. Bill Conley, who runs S&P Plus, my favorite statistical analysis, okay, the best power ratings out there, in my opinion. He said, according to his updated S&P Plus numbers on Sunday, run through games this Saturday, 7 of his top 10 defenses in the country are Big Ten schools. Big Ten is loaded right now on the defensive side of the ball. You've got Wisconsin, Ohio State, probably the 2 best defenses in the country. Statistically speaking, you've got Penn State, Michigan, Michigan State, Iowa, all with top 10 defenses. Minnesota quietly has actually been really, really good as well. And they're sneaking up on people. They're undefeated. You look at the Minnesota schedule, and it's a 3-game season for them. They're most likely to be 8-0 going to that game in a few weeks against Penn State. Then they've got Iowa, and then they've got that big game against Wisconsin, which could decide the West. Minnesota could very well be undefeated going into the Wisconsin game. I'm not ready to predict them beating Penn State or Iowa. They could be undefeated, or they could have a 2 or 3 game losing streak. I think 2, because I think it's Maryland, then Rutgers, then Penn State, Iowa, and then Wisconsin. But Minnesota, after those close calls that they had early in the year, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but the last couple games, they're starting to hit their stride and look really good. They beat Nebraska this past weekend pretty handily. They beat Illinois pretty handily, and those aren't great teams, but they're an undefeated team that's starting to take care of business. Now, don't get me confused on this. I'm not saying that Minnesota's anywhere near on Wisconsin's level. I think that they're a good but not a great team. Interestingly, if you look at net yards per play, the statistics that I've been talking about, Minnesota is plus 1.4 with offense and defense combined, which is actually in the top 15 in the country. So even relative to the competition, Minnesota has been playing well. But the Big Ten, it is very, very good right now. And I think Ohio State could actually afford a loss, especially to Wisconsin next weekend, because they're in a situation, even if they lost to Wisconsin, they could run the table, still win the Big Ten East, and then have a chance to beat Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship. And hey, I'm asking a lot for consistency of the College Football Playoff Committee, but we've been told, remember this happened last year, we were told that Oklahoma won every game on their schedule, right? They got an opportunity to beat Texas, and they beat them the second time around. They won every single game on their schedule. So I'm just saying, if we're looking for consistency, and I know that's a big ask of the College Football Playoff Committee, but then we have to hope if Ohio State were to lose to Wisconsin, that if they had the opportunity then to get things together, run the table, win the Big Ten East, win the Big Ten championship, and then beat Wisconsin, they would be 12-1. They would have wins against top 10 Wisconsin, top 10 Penn State, presumably, possibly even top 10 Michigan. I know it's crazy to say, but Michigan can sneak back into the top 10. They're actually playing really good defense. Their offense is not very good, but their defense most definitely has been above average. They're plus 1.1 in terms of yards per play on defense, better than their opponent's offensive season averages. So they're a sneaky good defense still. That offense is struggling. It's got a long way to go, but they're getting there. So if Ohio State wins those games and then beats Wisconsin in the championship, there's no way in my mind that they shouldn't be in. Now, I say no way from a standpoint that I'm assuming we're giving the committee enough credit to use the same rationale, the same criteria that they used to place teams last year. And we know that that's not true always, because if you think back to Ohio State having not beaten anybody when they lost to Michigan State in 2015, the committee didn't use the same rationale for putting Alabama ahead of Ohio State a few years ago. So we know that there's no consistency from the committee, but on paper, I think Ohio State could afford to lose to Wisconsin. Penn State's a little bit trickier, because if Penn State were to run out, and assuming they're not going to lose twice, then that means Ohio State would have to hope to get in with one loss. And I'm not sure that's a little bit of a dicier scenario. With Georgia losing this past weekend, things change just a little bit. But this Big Ten, man, guys and gals, this Big Ten's really good. And, Georgia losing to South Carolina this weekend, not a surprise, but it's certainly not a shock because Georgia's offense, if you've been watching them, they have problems. And I think Jake Fromm gets a little bit of a bad rap. I think he's a good quarterback. I don't think he's a great quarterback, but I think he gets some of the blame for that offense when watch those receivers. They have a real issue with that Georgia offense because they don't have playmakers offensively. They don't have skill guys that can shake defenders loose consistently. If you watch every pass that Jake Fromm throws, and I'm not suggesting you do, you'd probably have more fun going to a dentist and getting a cleaning. You'd probably have more fun watching paint dry. Our buddy Corey Thompson, co-host of Scarlet and Great podcast, he paints for a living. Maybe go watch him do his work. You might enjoy that more than watching the Georgia offense right now. But if you watch the Georgia offense play by play, every throw that Fromm makes, he doesn't have open receivers to throw to. Some would say, well, he's not able to throw receivers open, but you got to have guys that can get separation on defensive backs, and Georgia doesn't have that right now. Georgia has physical receivers that are strong, that they can catch the ball, but they're not getting open consistently. And that's one of Texas' problems, by the way. Texas' offense has actually been pretty good. Sam Ehlinger is a really good quarterback, but Texas is only running 4 yards a carry this year. They're not protecting Ehlinger, and they don't have receivers making big gash plays. They have possession receivers. They don't have guys going for big yardage, but that's Georgia's problem. Georgia losing to South Carolina doesn't shock me because of these issues that they've had offensively. So with Georgia going down, Florida, by the way, I give them credit. They looked better against LSU than I expected, but Florida's still a little bit overrated. And I'm going to get into that in a second because I have a big pet peeve about LSU passing Ohio State. I expected it. I get it. I understand the reasoning, but I do have a pet peeve. And not because it's Ohio State, but actually it's just a principled stand that I'm going to take here in a second. And I'll explain that. But Georgia going down helps Ohio State. Big Ten being good helps Ohio State. I know Buckeye fans don't want to think about a loss because Ohio State is so good right now. They're playing so well that it's just more fun to consider them running the table. It's better to expect them to win out and then not have to backdoor their way into the college football playoff. And I'm not even sure it'd be backdooring because if they're one of the 4 best teams, they're one of the 4 best teams. But it certainly feels better when a team just wins all their games and earns it without any question. Not that even being undefeated necessarily means that you're one of the 4 best teams. Clemson could win out in the ACC, and although I think that they would be one of the 4 best teams, winning out in the ACC this year certainly does not prove that. But that's going to happen. They're going to win out. By the way, I'm just going to say this. I'm going to go on a limb. Watch Louisville this week against Clemson. That Louisville team sneakily playing really good on offense. They're getting better. I have a feeling that game in Louisville is going to be a really good game. I'm not saying Louisville's going to win it, but I think they're going to give Clemson all they can handle. And that's probably the last team on the schedule that can do that. There's nobody else I see Clemson losing to from here on out. If it's not Louisville, then I don't know who it would be, at least in the ACC. But, so anyway, Georgia goes down. LSU comes up with a big win against Florida. Predictably, LSU passes Ohio State both in the coaches poll, moving up to number 3, Ohio State staying number 4, and in the AP where LSU actually jumps to number 2. I heard a lot of you say, why worry about this? Polls don't matter. That's not entirely true. Polls do actually matter. Do they decide the college football playoff? No. They're not part of the process like they were back in the BCS days. But here's the thing. I know for a fact, I've followed college basketball selection committee since I was 19 years old. Okay, almost 20 years. And I can promise you the AP and coaches polls are in that room when the selection committee goes to meet selection weekend. even though they're doing their own voting process and deciding who goes to the NCAA tournament through the at-large selection process, the AP poll very much plays a small role indirectly and subconsciously when they go to vote. And I'm going to tell you why, because when those 10 individuals go to select teams for each step of the voting process, they're looking at the AP poll and saying, okay, well, what order are these teams? I got to decide who I want to put on my ballot this next part of the process. So you better believe the AP poll is playing a factor in who gets in the NCAA tournament. Even though it's separate, it doesn't technically have anything to do with each other. It does play a role. And by the way, there's a high correlation showing this. I know correlation does not equal causation, but it still matters. And I believe firmly that it matters with college football too. How can it not? College football is the ultimate groupthink sport. It happens in rankings. It happens in message board discussions. It happens in every facet of college football. There's groupthink. When you have rankings that come out and have a predisposition to favoring one team or one conference from the very start of the season, before games are even played, rankings matter. Rankings affect more rankings. As the season goes along, every win and every loss is judged based on some kind of predisposition for how you viewed that team before the season began. And the selection committee are human beings, made up of human beings. They're people that are affected by bias. I'm not saying they go into that having a bias trying to, well, let's see how we can get another SEC team in the playoff. I don't think that they do that. But how can they not be impacted when for 10 weeks of the season, 12 weeks of the season, 13, 14, 15 weeks of the season, they're seeing certain narratives play out in the rankings and the media every single week? So when somebody says, well, don't worry about the polls, they don't matter, baloney, they don't matter, because these people are humans and they're part of the same groupthink that has always existed in college football. So I do care about the polls because they do matter. They do play a role. They impact how committee members view teams and view leagues. And they're susceptible to the same groupthink and narratives and media hype that we all are. So when we see a situation where LSU has a good win against Florida, but they jump Ohio State, for instance. Okay, this is just a good for instance because it's a talking point. It's something that I can make an example of. It makes me scratch my head a little bit. You got to remember, every single college football game, there's a winner and there's a loser. LSU this week was a 13-point favorite against Florida at home in Baton Rouge at Death Valley. They won by 14 points. Somebody had to win the game. It just so happened it was LSU, and they won by a margin that they were almost exactly favored by. If you were a college football voter, a member of the media, or a coach, we'll just stick to the media on this one because the AP took them from 6th to 2nd. If you were a college football media member and you thought before Saturday Ohio State was better than LSU based on the body of work and what you've seen, if you thought Ohio State was a better team than LSU, what happened this weekend that changed your mind? Was it the win against Florida? Was it winning by 2 touchdowns when you were favored by 2 touchdowns? At some point, there has to be common sense coming into the equation. LSU or Florida, somebody had to win that game. It turns out it was LSU winning by a margin that they were supposed to win by. Does them having the opportunity to play that game on their schedule, beating Florida, who, by the way, is not a top 10 team. I don't care what the rankings say. They're not a top 10 team. Does LSU playing that game and winning make them better than Ohio State? Put it another way. if Ohio State were playing Florida at home in the Horseshoe, does anybody think that Ohio State wouldn't have dispatched Florida by at least 14, maybe 17, 20, 21 points? Because I got news for you. The way this Ohio State team has played so far, that Florida team, if they played Florida, which, by the way, just interesting anecdote, Florida is not even in the top 20 in that yards per play metric that I've been mentioning in this episode. They're not even a top 20 team by that metric. Now, I'm not saying that metric is the end-all of the discussion, but that Florida team is not a top 10 team, I will tell you that. If Ohio State played that Florida team, I'm picking Ohio State to cover 21 points plus. I really am. And that's nothing against Florida. They're not bad. They're just not as good as the rankings suggest. But let's say that they are. Let's say that they're a borderline top 10 team. LSU was still favored at home. They were the higher-ranked team. They were supposed to beat Florida. Can you really walk away from that, watching that game, and say, oh, yeah, this LSU team, they're better than Ohio State? Because if you can't say that, then what are we doing here? What is the point of the rankings? Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I believe the rankings are supposed to be a measure of the best teams, qualitatively ranking the best teams. And there's room for merit. I get that. You're rewarding to some extent a win against a top 10 team. Fake top 10 team. We'll call them a top 20 team. You're rewarding LSU for a quality win. I get that. But at the end of the day, are we more worried about ranking the best teams, or are we more worried about merit and just rewarding the teams that have the best wins? Because at the end of the day, if the goal is to have the top 4 teams, rank the top 10 teams, rank the top 25 teams, I'm not sure what LSU did to change your mind. Is LSU a better team because they won at home by 2 touchdowns over a lower-ranked team that they were supposed to beat by 2 touchdowns? And that's where I have a problem with this. And again, it doesn't matter as far as the poll is concerned, but it does matter because it's just ongoing bias, ongoing narratives, media hype, stuff that can permeate into the selection committee's subconscious and affect how they vote. That stuff happens. Look, this LSU team in my metric, by the way, they were only 13th in the country, 1.3 yards over net, offense and defense combined, only 1.3 yards per play over what their opponents do throughout the course of the season. So LSU is at least statistically, arguably not even a top 5 or top 10 team. I think they're probably a top 10 team. Those statistics, they're not gospel. I would personally rank LSU in the top 10, but the teams that they've played are very overrated. Florida was actually the first defense that they've played all year long that was better than number 80 out of 130. Florida's defense, by the way, 57 out of 130. So they're barely average. So LSU is really benefiting from playing some really, really bad defenses. Everybody wants to talk about who Ohio State has played, who Ohio State hasn't played. Well, LSU has literally been beating up on dregs. Even Texas, for all the hype that they've got, is not even top 20 in the yards per play metric that I mentioned. So I'm not picking on LSU. I'm just saying, why would you put them ahead of Ohio State? If you didn't think they were better than Ohio State before the weekend, I'm not sure what they did to change your mind. At the end of the day, I think that this matters. I think merit matters. If you're picking the 4 best teams for a playoff, or what I hope to be 8 teams in the future, I think all this stuff matters. You got to take merit into account, because if you're truly a top 4 team, I think you have to prove it at some point. And the only way you can prove it is by beating other teams that are top 4, top 8, top 10, top 15 type of teams. So I think merit does matter. There's a time and a place for rewarding big wins. But if you're trying to rank qualitatively, I hate this outdated practice of saying, well, they beat a top 10 team this week, we've got to move them up. Again, you're basically saying because they played this game on their schedule where somebody had to win because they were the team that won, that therefore they get to be moved ahead of against a team that didn't play or didn't play as good of competition. That just doesn't make sense. You're basically saying, well, LSU beat Florida. Does that mean that Ohio State wouldn't have beat Florida given the same opportunity? I don't like changing rankings based on opportunity alone, based on schedule alone. And that's basically what happened in this scenario. I knew it was going to happen. I knew if LSU won, that was going to happen. But predictability isn't a rationalization. Anyway, again, it's not that big of a deal. The only reason I'm talking about it is because, in principle, it annoys me. I like where Ohio State is at. I like where these Big Ten teams are at. There are some really good Big Ten teams. Wisconsin, that's going to be a big boy football game next weekend. Penn State is going to be a great game. Penn State has athletic skill that's closer to Ohio State than maybe Wisconsin. But even though I said a couple weeks ago I thought Penn State was probably a better team, I'm pulling back on that just a little bit because Wisconsin continues to impress. I think Wisconsin's big boy football, Penn State is skill football. Two very different games. Michigan is going to be Michigan. Don't fool yourselves into believing that's going to be an easy game because Michigan has a defense that can keep with Ohio State, and I think that offense is still going to get better. It hasn't done it yet. I'm not with Jim Harbaugh. We're close to clicking on all cylinders. I'm not there, but they're going to be a tough game. So I will preview Northwestern later this week. It's a Big Ten game. It deserves preview. It deserves at least a cautionary, even if it's a cautionary tale, it deserves some sort of analysis. We're going to do that Wednesday and Friday on Unscripted Ohio. I'm sure Johnny Bullitt and Corey Thompson will be discussing it Tuesday and Thursday on Scarlet and Great. By the way, we may have a network announcement coming up here. I'm hoping later this week. Still trying to work out the details. If that comes up, I'll be sure to let you know. Could be a big deal. Pretty cool thing. Don't know how that's going to work just yet. But we will have some football talk the rest of the week. Of course, Chris Drew will be talking about the Browns. Browns, tough loss again to the Seahawks on Sunday. Now 2-4. Not the season Browns fans had imagined. Chris will unpack all of that. What does that mean for the Brownies? That's coming up tomorrow on Dog Days podcast. And Thursday, Shane Larson will recap a huge weekend in college football and look ahead to next weekend as well. That's on Thursday on Gridiron Game Time. Please check me out on Twitter at KYLam8. Check Unscripted Ohio on Twitter at Unscripted Ohio 1. You can listen to any of these podcasts on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. That's going to do it for me. Hope everybody has a great week. We'll be back on Wednesday to preview Ohio State Northwestern. Take care, everybody.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.